folks. I'm John Goldberg Hiller, and I'm coordinating the Political Science Colloquium for this year. Welcome to the first of our series for the spring. Before I introduce Jairus, let me just tell you a little bit about who is coming. So in the next month and a half or so, about every 2 weeks, Dziga Wadownik will be giving a talk in a couple of weeks, Hito Kimura, John Zern from the English department, and Sarah Wheaton from political science. It's a special pleasure to introduce Jairus Grove. He is Associate Professor of Political Science and the Director of the Hawaii Research Center for Future Studies. Although Jairus has a special interest in the ecology of warfare, he is as close as I know to a polymath and contributes theoretically and collegially across the political science department. Future studies, international relations, political theory, public policy, and more. Jairus has 2 books coming out this year, and perhaps in light of recent events and the subject of this talk, we should cautiously anticipate a large launch. One of his book, Savage Ecology, Geopolitics at the End of the World, will be coming out of Duke University Press. And the second, Target Practice, Automated Killing and the Dehumanization of American Sovereignty, will be coming out this spring from Rowman and Littlefield. Jairus' talk today is entitled, This Is Not a Drill, The Return to Nuclear War Fighting, Terror, and the New Normal. Please help me welcome Jairus Grove.
Thanks, John, for letting me change my topic at the last minute. Everybody can hear me in the back, right? I don't need the mic. We're good? Great. I wanted to give a little bit of background on where the talk came from. It's an unusual talk for me in that the paper's already written, which almost never happens. And it was funny because when I posted on Facebook for a couple of friends who I thought might come from outside the university, the comment that came back from a friend of mine who's actually a nuclear scenario planner for the Department of Defense is, wow, what a timely talk. I was like, actually, I wrote it in 2005. And I say that for 2 reasons. One is that I want to make it clear that I'm going to jump up and down on President Donald Trump, but for very opportunistic reasons. I have plenty of other things I jump up and down on for, but it's actually a long-term problem. And the second is that it is an endemic problem. So the first time I did this research, it was between 2005 and 2007 with one of my advisors at the time, Daniel Dudley. We were also working with the APL, the Advanced Physics Laboratory, talking about kind of the future of nuclear deterrence and nuclear weapons. It all seemed like a big deal. By the time Bush left office, we were like, well, I guess we're never going to finish this. It's never going to be a thing. It's like, we just got a disarmament precedent, right? And then, you know, by the end of Obama's administration, I was sort of waiting around like, hey, can we get some movement on arms control, maybe, sort of, a little? Nothing happened. You know, I think there were real interests, and there's some crazy stories about Hillary Clinton trying to work out a deal between Egypt and Israel to get Israel to seriously lock down their weapons. But we don't see any major movement. A month before the election of Donald Trump, I got invited to go to West Point for the 50th anniversary of Thomas Schelling's Arms and Influence. It's as close to a Bible for nuclear deterrence as one can have. And the idea was we were supposed to go there and revisit kind of what is going to mean to have nuclear deterrence, if there was a future for deterrence. I was there to say there was no future for deterrence, non-state actors, et cetera, et cetera. And I think all of us who were invited were prepared to talk about what kind of nuclear posture we expected under Hillary Clinton. We found out 5 days before we gave the talk that Hillary Clinton was in fact not going to be president. And most of us also found that we weren't really changing what we had to say very much. So I say all that in that it's amazing how little politics ends up mattering in regards to US nuclear policy and how much it actually impacts the institution of democracy. So why talk about Trump now? I'll talk about this a little bit more at the end, but the reality is we only get things done on executive power when we don't like the executive. And it's that opportunistic. No one really trusts this executive that much, even the ones who support him. I guess if you got him a little drunk would say, well, I don't support him. They just they have a certain kind of party identification. So I think now is a really essential time if we care about executive power to think about reining it in. And I'll talk about why I think that's true. So what I'm going to try to do is give you a little bit of a history of why nuclear weapons became so fundamentally undemocratic as compared to other forms of warfare. And then talk about why I think that's actually precipitated a lot of what we are seeing happening on the Korean Peninsula right now. And then hopefully have a lot of time so that you can ask questions about really anything you want, and if I know something about it, I'll tell you as much as I can, which includes trying to follow up with some folks who work in disaster management and others about kind of what happened on Saturday and, how crazy or how uncrazy it was. And hopefully, that'll make everybody think like there may be something else to do besides, crawling under our entirely wooden houses. Because I think this is a political crisis. It exceeds a constitutional crisis, and it certainly exceeds a technical crisis. So a couple of quick things that I know now are very politically controversial, but I just want to get them out of the way. The first is that facts are real. I'm going to start from that proposition. I find myself having to fight this question a lot more than I would have expected, particularly when it comes to questions of national security. Moynihan has this great line. He was arguing in Congress. He said, "You have a right to your opinion, but you do not have a right to your own facts." This is pretty much how I have to start every undergrad class now. Two, Donald Trump was not democratically elected, but no more or less than any other president. That normally has a coincidence between the opinion of voters and the opinion of electors. The office of the president is not fundamentally democratic, it's Republican. It is a representative system, and it is a guardianship system, which holds over to a lack of universal franchise and suffrage. But just to remind you, because facts matter, Clinton won 48% of the vote, Trump won 42% of the vote. So any illusion we have that these particular electors represented a democratic process, I think is nil. And I think that's actually important when we start thinking about the fact that only the president likely decides whether or not we all live or die in engaging in nuclear warfare. The next, because it surprises some people, is the United States possesses 6,800 nuclear weapons. And those are actually counted as delivery vehicles, meaning those are missiles or bombs that can deliver a warhead. The thing is, most our missiles deliver 12 warheads. So do the math, right? Average warhead size on a MIRV rocket is like 886 kilotons. So that's a lot of explosive. My old advisor used to say it basically breaks up. You could give 10,000 pounds of TNT to every American citizen and just ask them to keep it in their basement. And that's about the equivalent of nuclear explosive power we have, which is, probably a really bad idea. The next is that nuclear deterrence's effectiveness is maybe one of the best examples in the social sciences that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. We have no data that nuclear deterrence works. What we have is the absence of data that it fails. But in fact, we actually have many accounts. We have lots of records declassified from the Soviet Union. The deterrence failed several times, including during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And what saved us was not the brilliance of game theory or some sort of PSYOP model of how nuclear command should happen, but generally because somebody flinched and said, I'm not willing to kill millions of people, even though that's the logical thing that I should pursue. And anyone who says otherwise, I dare them to say where that data is. If it's classified somewhere, I would love to know that. I'll get access to it. But we do not have deterrence data. What we have is best practices and a theory, which we hope we never have to test. The last is there's no button. Not just on Saturday morning, but there's no button in the White House. This is like one of the things I have to tell people in class the most often. There is a thing that sometimes they used to call the football, which is actually a briefcase full of codes, which allow the president to prove that he's the president and not Alec Baldwin. That's what those codes do. They do not launch the missiles, but it does still mean that only the president has that ability to authorize, except in a couple of circumstances I'm going to talk about. It is not congressional. There is no way for what we think of as the balance of power defined by the Constitution to check that process in any way. Those codes cannot be withdrawn. That access cannot be withdrawn, short of someone refusing an order. So quick constitutional review for those who are like, well, why is that a problem? I mean, the president's got the right to declare war, right? The president does not have the right to declare war. The Congress shall have power to declare war, grant letters of marque and reprisals, to make rules concerning captures on land and water. That should be pretty cut and dry. You cannot declare war. And so what happens, and we'll get into the 1950s, is why somehow nuclear weapons get exempted from that process. The other problem is almost everything else called war got exempted from that process too. So in the oath of office, it says the president must preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. That oath has been overinterpreted by people like Alexander Hamilton to mean that the direction of war, when authorized or begun, is solely under the understanding of the commander-in-chief as defined by the Constitution. And I think what we'll show develops, I think, much faster than some of you might expect, is when a war is about to happen, when it's ongoing, becomes so indeterminate that not the constitutional basis, but the ability to stop the president becomes sort of a factually non-existent process. Even if that authority exists, even if it's not what the Constitution meant, there is no way, in some sense, particularly when it comes to nuclear war, because calling those things back takes more than a dog whistle. So this process lasted exactly 4 years. So that whole Congress should control the question of war actually got undone within the first president's administration. It's basically George Washington's fault, but it's actually Hamilton's fault. Hamilton told Washington, you should abrogate the collective security alliance we have with France. We had a treaty obligation to defend France in any time of war. Hamilton was like, I've got a genius idea. Declare peace instead of war. It's exactly the same executive power, but everybody's going to love you for it, because everybody loves peace. So he declared peace, violated the treaty, overstepped the congressional grounds, and sparked what's called the Helvidius Pacificus debates. Of course, in this case, the person taking war powers was Pacificus, right? It was Hamilton, basically, via Washington. And Helvidius was James Madison, who was basically the sort of player for Thomas Jefferson. And they fight out over the question of where the executive stops and where Congress begins. And ultimately, Congress never takes the action to rein this back in. So this real fight between sort of Hamilton's view of the necessity of a strong executive of foreign policy fundamentally wins out in practice only. But practice becomes a kind of law. The infamous legal scholar Carl Schmitt, who particularly loves this moment in history, I get the Latin wrong, said necessitas et legem. The law of necessity beat the law of the Constitution. Now, there's a whole history of how this sort of takes off under Jackson and Hamilton, or rather under Lincoln, particularly during the Civil War. I'm not going to get into that. I'm going to skip ahead to the nuclear era, because this is when things get particularly crazy. No one knew how to control the bomb when it was invented. Right? There wasn't a sense that it was a weapon of difference, meaning that there was some sort of fire break between conventional capability and nuclear capability. It was just a really big bomb. So it wasn't weird from that perspective. After World War II, it became clear that we were going to have to make a whole lot more of these bombs, and that we were going to have to try to centralize it, and it was centralized entirely under the executive. So the president from time to time may direct the commission to deliver such quantities of special nuclear material and atomic weapons to the DoD in the interest of national defense, to authorize the DoD to manufacture, produce, acquire any atomic weapon or utilization facilitation for military purposes. The reason why this is so constitutionally important is because even though regular conventional war powers get out of hand in the 20th century, Congress can still say things like, sorry, but the end strength cap is 200,000 active duty soldiers. Congress can still say, I'm going to tug the purse strings real hard. Or we're going to withdraw that authorization of force. The difference is the Atomic Energy Act actually establishes not just the authority of the president, but the means of the president to acquire everything they need to functionally maintain a distinct arsenal within the government. It was never imagined by the Constitution. The Supreme Court never reined it in. And as a practice, it came to define what we now think of, I think, as a national security state. And so I think that things like the NSA, things like the spying programs we are talking about now, have more of a relationship to this attempt to carve out a unique role for the executive in times of extreme emergency than they do to some other kind of story about espionage. This led to what we often think of as kind of the golden age of nuclear war fighting. meaning when we actually thought that we should use nuclear weapons on the battlefield. You can go to YouTube and watch the crazy tests where they had people with shoulder-mounted nuclear weapons. There's a nuclear cannon we developed. Real bad idea. Right? There were a lot of these things. And these were not without consequence. I want to be very clear that the people who paid the consequence for this mostly were Western Shoshone. They were downwinders who lived near the test facilities. These weapons, in the attempt to diversify how many kinds of nuclear weapons we had, we now put the casualty rate in the 300,000 range. So it just got revised by the federal government's audit about 6 weeks ago. And so we think 300,000 Americans either died or contracted cancer as a result of these tests. So this is a sort of major period of trying to innovate how we could use these weapons. Ultimately, what got locked in was called the first offset. It was the idea that we would never have as many tanks as the Soviet Union. That line goes on forever. The British invented tanks. The Germans perfected tanks. The Russians owned tanks by the just boatloads. And they were on the other side of the Iron Curtain. The United States could not possibly deploy enough forces or enough tanks. And so the decision was made to put what were called tactical nuclear weapons into the field so that if the tanks started coming over the line, they would not need presidential authorization to hold the Iron Curtain back. Right? That was the argument, right? Why we needed more flexibility in decision making. And I think this is actually a really critical moment in this history, because it's the moment where not only does Congress say the president's involved entirely over the decision, it's the moment also Congress says, and the president can give it to whoever they want. Right? So this is different than when we normally think about plenary power, where Congress can give something to somebody, or the president can give something to somebody, but they can take it back. This is like the president's on their own. The second is that we really got into the idea of low-yield weapons, that we could really control the output of nuclear devices such that we could concentrate them or use them, quote-unquote, in theater, and even have our soldiers working alongside them. And I think you'll see that that's actually very important to the way that we think about what is and isn't possible in North Korea, given we have 26,000 troops just a few miles away in Seoul. The last is it's just important to remember how crazy all this was. Herman Kahn wrote a book called On Escalation, another one called On Thermonuclear War. In both books he suggested that actually we should become comfortable with the quote-unquote unthinkable, and we should actually start having more nuclear combat, and that what everybody needed was just a shovel. That we way overblew how bad radiation was. And if you could just dig a foxhole for yourself and your family and kind of get in the hole, everything would be fine. And importantly for Kahn, that was actually an essential part of nuclear strategy. We need to start becoming more confident in our ability to survive nuclear wars so that we could start waging nuclear wars when the comparative advantage came about. This guy was not a fringe guy. He was sort of considered the genius of the nuclear program. The next big major event that we have is the War Powers Act of 1973. And this actually is one of the reasons why I think the Trump story is so important here. Basically the humiliation of Nixon and a crisis of confidence in the executive office made it possible to revisit many of the policies that had unraveled, not just in Vietnam, but also in Laos and Cambodia. And so we actually do see at least a little bit of a restatement and a reassertion of Congress. Basically, they put a timestamp on how long the president can do these crazy things, when they have to notify Congress, and when they can pull it back. Which should be good, right? It should kind of bring some kind of constitutional balance back. In fact, Jeffrey Stone, who's a constitutional scholar at the University of Chicago, sees this as one of the prime examples of what he calls the elasticity paradigm. That the United States is actually a great case in the way that democracies may lose democratic control during times of war, but that it always bounces back to where it started. And this is his example. The counter to that example is that the phrase when discussing nuclear weapons during the debate and in the act itself was that the nuclear weapons were an executive arsenal, that the War Powers Act did not in any way constrain nuclear decision-making by the presidency. This gets further affirmed under the Carter administration. Again, right, Republican, Democrat, doesn't make a huge lot of difference. Presidential Directive 59, that nuclear weapons employed policy, was signed by Jimmy Carter in 1980. It basically allowed the president not only to decide when to launch, but to completely change where the priorities were for U.S. national foreign policy. And it was part of what was called, it's so weird, look, shoot, look. The idea was that we had so much command control information technology and the ability to have bunkers and fight and win nuclear wars that we needed to give the president the flexibility to completely define and redefine who an enemy was so that we could fight an extended nuclear war without having to worry about Congress. Hence, look, shoot, hide, look, shoot again, right? That it would be this sort of like going back and forth. And that we needed to more or less be able to decapitate the rest of the government and allow the president to take over. So, you know, let's put it this way, it's not a great picture so far, right? If what we think of as democracy is that the people have a fundamental sense of control over something as important as life and death, not so much. If we don't think we live in a democracy, we think we live in a republic, right? Meaning that representational systems are supposed to be a kind of check and balance defined by the Constitution. That's also not what we have. What we have is we got really lucky with enlightened despotism. We got really lucky that no other president so far has ever made the decision to completely abrogate the intent of the Constitution, start, end, and potentially prevent any other war from happening again. Right? There is no institutional mechanism to constrain that. Now, the very last thing that people will say when they're like, oh, it's really not that bad, because the military would never allow us to do anything so crazy. Which, by the way, the military, when I talk to people who've been in these positions, hate. Because they say that's not democracy, that's a coup d'etat. It's interesting, you hear that from the people making those decisions and not from the Democrats. But here's what happened most recently when this was brought up about Trump. General Hinton said, and if it's illegal, meaning a strike that wasn't authorized, guess what's going to happen? I'm going to say, Mr. President, that's illegal. And guess what he's going to do? He's going to say, what would be legal? And we'll come up with options for a mix of capabilities to respond to whatever situation the situation is. That's the way it works. It's not that complicated. I want to say two things about this. The first is this is unbelievably optimistic, because we're going to talk about how I think this kind of posturing, where the president has the authority to literally like wipe whole countries off the map, is how we get at crisis escalation in the first place. During a crisis, it's very improbable that someone will refuse an order. It is also the case that what puts us in a crisis is precisely the ability of the bully pulpit and the president to create that instability in the first place. There is a feedback there that the strategic command is not likely to be able to interrupt. It's also the possibility that they would get killed trying to do it. But at the very least, what I want to say is even if we accept that most optimistic position, that fits no definition of democracy I've ever heard of. No one elected this general. There's no way to recall this general. No one technically elected Trump, except for the electors. That is not a Republican institution. It's one of the least democratic holdovers from when our Constitution was least democratic. And that's where we are, right? We are in an entirely undemocratic situation in terms of the determination of the use of nuclear force. Now, this actually matters a lot under the George W. Bush administration. So I want to jump back just a little bit. Because this is when we first have the attempt to sort of exit an era of what we call mutually assured destruction, where each side checks the other because of their ability to destroy them, and the attempt to actually develop the capability for first strike capacity with assuredness. Meaning that the United States could hit all of its enemies at once, get all of their weapons, and the only consequences would be the fact that some of that radiation might eventually get to the United States. This was not a capability we ever had during the Cold War. There are a few times where we got ahead, where we had what were called marginal gains, but the idea of being able to actually take out everything and bear no consequence was unique to that administration. And interestingly, is most evident in the torture memo, which sort of sews it all back together. In John Yoo's original torture memo, he said the reason why we have extraordinary powers is because we live in extraordinary times. Terrorism completes the extraordinariness that nuclear weapons already ushered in. So he uses the fact that the executive already had complete control of nuclear weapons because of what he called the extraordinary means of being able to fight a war of 30 minutes, and said that by analogy, every terrorist was a living nuclear war when it came to temporality and the interpretation of the president's oath to need to respond in very short time to an imminent threat. So that expands. The second is that we actually get a kind of revenge of Hamilton in the sense that Hugh goes one step further. He says, okay, we've got nuclear weapons and we've got terrorists, so actually we don't need an imminence test anymore because it's always imminent. Imminence becomes imminent, to make a bad philosophy joke. But that we always live in a situation in which a war is sort of always already happened, right? Anyone could happen at any potential moment. So we don't have to wait or make a judgment about imminence. It's just here, and that's permanent. He literally said the state of emergency is a permanent state. And that was combined with a lot of new enemies and a lot of new nuclear risks. So the concern was primarily nuclear terrorism. So what did they do? Bush shows up at Congress and he's like, I would love a new nuclear arsenal. I want smaller, more usable weapons. I want faster weapons. I want an easier system that doesn't cost as much money through the Stockpile Stewardship Program. We need them now. World of terrorism. Congress, you always give me whatever I want. We're all scared to death. And Congress says no. It's actually kind of unprecedented. They're like, this is too much money. You already have 6,000 weapons. No new weapons. We will not greenlight the development of a new generation of nuclear weapons. This is vitally important because it's the same time we're debating the CTBT and whether or not we should finally ratify that damn thing and not have above-ground nuclear testing, which gave 300,000 people cancer. And even though it got bipartisan support, it was at least a shift that we should consider that. Bush said, well, I've got unlimited power. So instead of getting the congressionally supported one, they harvested all the weapons we had left over from the START treaties. Thousands upon thousands of nuclear pits stored in places like Amarillo. And they reconfigured the W-76, which was on all of our submarine, nuclear submarines. They MIRVed all the missiles, means multiple reentry vehicles, and they gave them the ability to blow up just over the ground, which technically is what you do when you want to hit another target first, right? The other side's nuclear weapons are deep underground, they're covered in concrete and steel. If you can blow up your weapon just above the surface, rather than high in the atmosphere or on the ground, you create so much overpressure by evaporating the air that it literally sucks the silo out. Like, have you ever seen this really horrible YouTube videos with the sits and thing? Yeah, think that. Right? It literally just sucks it out. It is not a weapon you use to hit another target. It's a weapon you use to prevent another target from launching. These were deployed extensively. They took all the Air Force's MX delivery vehicles and increased not only the accuracy but the number of devices on each submarine. And they deployed them more frequently to the back of the Pacific, where they could, on a depressed trajectory, hit Russia through the section that they no longer had an early warning system and saturate every single Russian nuclear site with 6 to 9 entry vehicles. So 6 to 9 times 12. Right, so that's the model that gets developed. It's a totally new infrastructure and nuclear posture. Carl Lieber and Darryl Press basically announced this in Foreign Affairs magazine, that Washington basically has called the bluff of the rest of the world. Moscow has no functioning nuclear submarines at this point in time, so they have no second strike capability, which means that if we can get all their missiles, they're done for. China is even worse. I'll talk about them in a second. And that as a result, there is no longer this world of triad versus triad, meaning bomber, land-based, sea-based. Basically, the United States is the last triad, and everybody else is a sitting duck. Bragging about this, by the way, did not make Russia and China happy. And that's maybe part of the North Korea story I'll get to in just a second. China was even worse off. China only had refuelable, mostly stationary rockets, meaning we knew exactly where they were, we could take them out. We bragged that we could. And as a result, China was also, it had no second strike capability. So that idea of mutually assured destruction, that if you hit us, we'll hit you back, is over. Right? We fundamentally ended it. And then we flashed our ass and bragged about it. Now you can imagine what happened. And in fact, hopefully you pay attention, which is that immediately Russia was like, we had this other second strike capability. We got rid of it because submarines were a lot more reliable and a lot less scary, but don't we have a bunch of heavy bombers left over from World War II in like the 1960s, and we could just like load them up with missiles and fly them 24 hours a day and refuel in the air and hope that no accidents take place? And somebody said, yeah, we've got those, and they put them back in the air. So in response, Russia restarted what is a much less stable second strike capability. and started doing what has now become almost a quadrennial event, which is every time we get a new president, they fly one of the bombers at Alaska or Canada and pull out at the last minute. So if you've noticed these stories which sound like some kind of viral marketing campaign for Top Gun 2, where Russia is like, you know, buzzing a ship or buzzing another plane, this is part of a response of trying to close that gap. Most recently and most disturbingly, the way they closed that gap is they realized if we've got to build new submarines, why put people on them? Russia has deployed its first nuclear drone. So there are drone submarines that carry a 100 megaton nuclear device. They are not covered under the START Treaty because they are not a missile. They're a drone. They crawl around the ocean until they blow up. And China similarly has developed solid fuel technology, much more mobile lifters, and they have made their system vastly less stable as a result as well. Which brings us to, you know, is the Trump doctrine kind of maintaining of this? Is it a kind of expansion of this? What does that look like? I'll say the reason why I skipped over Obama is that Obama didn't reverse any of these things. Right? We did not somehow retask our fleet. I mean, there may have been some sort of secret communique I don't know about that, like we don't scare them as often. But we certainly didn't try to scale back the level at which we made our adversaries feel not just vulnerable, but terrified. Right? I don't know about you, but on Saturday morning, for me, that felt like what they call in torture circles, a false execution. Right? A mock execution. You produce the feeling that you're about to die. And you decide what that happens to. We've done that 3 times to North Korean civilians in the last year, where they were not able to distinguish between a bunch of B-2 bombers flying at them that could go stealth at any moment and pulling back at the last minute. And so they had to send out their warnings as well. I think it's too early to say we explicitly have a Trump doctrine, but we do have a nuclear posture review that's just been leaked. I think it was leaked, so we'll have discussions about it. I have interviewed one of the architects of it pretty extensively. He reminds me a lot of Herman Kahn, and he's like 10 years younger than I am, I think, which scares me because he's going to live a long time. But I will say that what's interesting about the nuclear posture review is how similar it is to the logic of the Bush administration, in the sense that it's a renewed emphasis on not just trying to counter the capabilities of our adversaries, but to actually have primacy over them. So when I asked, well, don't you think it would be better if we at least had a balance of terror again and we could kind of scale some of these back? He said, no. I think this situation means we need a lot more bombs. And that's the phrase he kept using. We need 3 times as many bombs. And you actually see that in the NPR. The other thing the NPR declares is that we have a return to great power war and great power politics. It says this in the kind of passive voice you would never let your undergrads get away with, like, great power war, it came from nowhere, right? Like that nobody may have restarted this fight a bit. And that more importantly, that our adversaries now, because of their instability, which is, again, their fault, will pursue what are called escalate to de-escalate strategies. Meaning because they don't have as many weapons that are as accurate, per se, as we do, they will try to get an advantage by showing their resolve. Meaning they won't de-escalate by backing up, because they don't trust we'll stop, because they saw what we did in Iraq and Afghanistan. They will nuke something to raise the costs of us continuing. Meaning they will try to escalate so that we will de-escalate. And that's one of the things that we see in the Baltic region with Russians. I certainly think it's a big part of the picture for what we see in North Korea. And it's part of the reason why North Korea is willing to do what is the equivalent of an act of genocide, which is potentially wipe out the Hawaiian people and the Chamorro people, so that it can play a game of geopolitics with the United States. The number 3, which is actually more disturbing, I think, even than the Bush administration, is a return to Carter's flexible command policy, which is this necessity that because there's going to be cyber attacks, we can't rely on C3I anymore, and so more different people need to be able to have the authority to launch weapons. Again, there's no congressional review of this process. There was a congressional audit by the GAO in the first Clinton administration, 3 years in. 2 things came out. 1, no one knew how many people had the authority to launch nuclear weapons. They couldn't give an answer. They gave 5 different answers at 5 different committee meetings. And Clinton finally admitted that he lost the card that had the consolidated codes for 6 months and didn't want to tell anybody because he was embarrassed. So like somewhere like the image, there was a Post-it note. The last is that there is a heavy emphasis in the Trump doctrine on usable weapons and needing to fill in the escalation ladder so that we have more tactical nuclear weapons which compete directly with upstart countries like North Korea and compete directly with, they think, the ability and resolve of Russia to use weapons on the battlefield. That means more devices to keep track of. Anybody know what the DoD gold standard is for a weapons platform? What percentage of reliability a program has to have to continue? 70%. All right, 70%. So if we already have 6,800 weapons, and we're going to up that to something like 10,000, what does 30% of non-control of weapons look like? Just think about that for a minute. And if you don't think that's possible, I encourage you to read Schlosser's Command and Control, which involves one dropping a nuclear bomb out of a plane, luckily it wasn't armed, having to disarm one at one point in time because it was about to go off, and yes, shooting a guy in the head because he dropped a bunch of acid and was playing In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida with a hammer on an open warhead. So every time we add one of these weapons, we're adding a certain kind of risk. North Korea. This will be the last thing, and then I'll talk about solutions. There are three things going on which I think reflect this Trump doctrine. The first is that this is very much a return to not the Cold War playbook of even Reagan to like try to get out of this thing through arms control, or the Cold War playbook of Kissinger and Nixon, which right now sounds like a Swedish massage. This is the Cold War playbook of the first half of the Cold War. How do we get an advantage, and how do we short-circuit competitors before they can get an advantage? Meaning an active drive for what Schelling called compellence, which is quite different than deterrence. Deterrence is stopping your enemies. Compellence is having so much power to destroy that you can tell your enemies what to do and they comply. We gave up on compellence a long time ago because it's a crazy dream, and it's definitely bad. The second is, and we don't actually get very much airplay about this, but McMaster's believes that the way that North Korea is pursuing its nuclear capability is not just a deterrent strategy, it's a stymie strategy so that it can invade South Korea and we will not take the risk of holding on to the peninsula. There are a couple of reasons for this. I think partly, Trump has done a lot to shake the U.S.-Japan security alliance, and certainly a lot to shake the U.S.-Korea alliance. I think part of that is also that for McMaster's, like all good nuclear war planners, and I actually understand this once you accept the craziness of the logic, there's nothing to stop them from using the same strategy of deterrence as a strategy for reunification. Meaning, if they actually can demonstrate that they have the ability to deter the United States, because we're not willing to accept the loss of Hawaii and Guam, which one recent American referred to as we would give them up because they're not America proper. I want everybody to feel that, because we don't often get the opportunity to feel what it must be like to be in Guam, but we have been added to the category of not America proper, which is why it can be bargained over in a way that California can't. So he thinks that if that's true, then we can't wait for that to happen, right? Because reunification means a kind of consolidated bloc that the United States would be constantly under threat of. The third, and I think it's one of the other biggest dangers, is that part of compellence is showing resolve, and there are major influential people who think it's time to give North Korea what's called a bloody nose, meaning take out some significant counterforce target, something that's valuable to their military, to show them that we mean business. The problem, and I think Van Jackson made a very good case for this in the Japan Times, this is a crowded neighborhood. The way that you give somebody a bloody nose in a conflict like this is you pull back all of your invasionary forces. Sufficiently so that when you smack that radar array, they can look out and say, well, they're not in range to invade. This is just a bloody nose strike. There is no amount we can pull back far enough, given the nature of our stealth bomber fleet and our heavy bomber fleet, in which we could expect that UN would interpret a bloody nose as merely a bloody nose and not the beginning of an invasion. These are all reasons why, for me, I think that this is actually a real crisis. This wasn't just a false warning. This is a false warning on, for me, a 60-year crisis. We should be able to demand that there be some kind of oversight and restriction. precisely because by the time this kind of nuclear bullying escalates to conflict, such that North Korea starts putting missiles into the field, conventional or otherwise, that moment where they're going to say, oh, President, this is crazy, this is illegal, has already passed, right? So we've set up a situation in which there's no democratic control at the front end to prevent the crisis escalation, such that any moderate amount of enlightened despotism on the back end would make a difference. And I think that is actually really important. I think that we actually have a shot to make this a major issue. Democrats have already brought this before Congress. It didn't get a lot of traction, in part because there hadn't been a major crisis. I know it's unusual for arms control to say we should start local, go global, but I actually think one of the reasons why arms control has been derailed so many times is precisely because of the kind of power the president has to derail the process. Constraining the United States may in fact be the essential component to having anything like global arms control. And if you think that's crazy, think about how executive power has destabilized the planet since 2001. And think about which particular executive power it did, right? The war in Iraq was a totally unnecessary war. It's completely destabilized the Middle East. It means that there may someday be a nuclear arms race in the Middle East. The invasion of Afghanistan is still lingering, right? Executive power was used to expand all these wars beyond the congressional means and control. We have an exceedingly weak president by any measure. He's exceedingly dangerous at the same time, but it means that there's the possibility of review. There may also be a midterm revolt. These are fingers crossed. I don't know if it'll actually happen, but one of the most frustrating things about being, I don't know, interested in democracy is the people who are interested in democracy tend to wait until after the opportunity has passed. We're like, wouldn't it have been awesome if, right? Like this is a moment where, we don't have a lot of time, but we may have until the end of this presidency to put the problem of executive power back on the agenda and find very weird allies, right? Because the same kind of nuclear power that we're talking about that's totally unrestricted is very related to NSA questions, which actually weirdly get traction on the left and the right. They're very connected to problems we have about the abuse of executive privilege. There's a whole suite of issues that make this, I think, a much more credible political agenda item than we'd expect. And the last, and I'll say this, is that I think people on the left would be surprised how much Republicans do not like the idea that a coup d'etat, an end of civil military relations, is what we're banking on for rational nuclear decision making. This makes a lot of people uncomfortable. There's a reason why things like the Nunn-Lugar program are bipartisan bills. When nuclear weapons go on the table, people start to take notice. And I think that's a reason why, even though we tend to focus on domestic issues, this is a very critical time in which we've got North Korea showing us exactly what the danger is of this kind of executive-led policy. And exactly what the danger is of not knowing what the review process is. And also having a president that, in a street fight couldn't, hold his own against Groucho Marx. So, questions, concerns?
I was glad to find disdain for Hamilton, allies in that. If we look at the War Powers Act, it has been very non-constraining. And partly the reason for that is within the terms of it itself. The Whigs found as early as the Mexican War that once troops are committed, it's very difficult to gain control of the situation again.
Right.
And the War Powers Act basically allows the troops to get committed in the first place, which is one of the reasons I think it's been ineffective.
Right.
So in trying to control presidential use of nuclear weapons, there is a whole different temporality to the situation. And one of the problems that you face is that...
Can I stop you there? Because that's already a big question. Yeah. And I've got an answer, because this temporality question is actually really important. It's the basis of the whole thing. So let me address that first, and then maybe we'll come back around. The argument for why this had to keep getting more and more centralized all the way up to Carter was the premise that we needed to be able to use nuclear weapons quickly to preempt the use of nuclear weapons. I actually want to call that entire idea into question for two reasons. The first is that that may be true, but it completely dismisses the possibility that that capability itself actually makes the risk of nuclear war more likely in the first place. So if it's a balance of security question, the temporality may be exactly backwards, which is the ability for particularly the US president to escalate to the point of nuclear war is what creates the kind of escalation cycles where we need to act quickly in the first place. So that's part one. The second is that given the way in which nuclear weapons had developed historically, not constitutionally, there is no instance now, right? There was a moment for, I said, that's why I call it the shortest shadow. There was a moment of primacy that lasted basically 3 or 4 months. My guess is because of the ways in which you can innovate and mock and do all sorts of things, and the fact that actually one of the smallest economies in the world is already showing us we don't have primacy, that any other country can question primacy too, which means that a preemptive strike is never in the interests of the United States. And this idea of marginal gains, that we could use some combination of the national missile defense and the ability to have so many weapons so that like 10% of the US population would survive some kind of strategic nuclear exchange, is just bonkers. Not bonkers because I wouldn't save 10% of the human population if I could save them, of course I would, but because the risk calculus is totally inside out, right? Which is, what is the systemic cause of why we got to a point of marginal gains in the first place? And so for me, it's a balancing test, and even very pragmatically, if I didn't think these weapons were immoral, they are not doing the job they were designed to do, and it's actually the speed that is undermining them. So that's part one. Part two is the speed argument is actually really dangerous even for us who are disarmament advocates. There is a significant portion of the Department of Defense that wants nuclear disarmament because it will make the world safe for executive conventional ICBMs. It's called the Prompt Global Strike System, which is to take all those delivery vehicles, all 6,000 of them, put conventional warheads on them, and make soldiers obsolete. So that the president, without any congressional review, can send 50 conventional, large, huge, I mean, we're still going to be wiping out, block after city block, mile after mile, with no congressional oversight. And so if we don't first lock down the authority to do that kind of independent act, getting rid of the warheads actually doesn't get us very far. In the same way that nuclear weapons killed people for an entire century without having a war because they were tested on people's lands, those ICBMs without nuclear warheads will kill a very particular kind of population. The very kinds of populations we now intervene in. And so I actually think the temporality argument, unlike the war powers, right, it means that there should be strict congressional control, not notification. It should be a congressional arsenal until we figure out what to do with them. Yeah, and it has to be a bright line.
The point I was going to make was, somehow though, you're going to have to distinguish between the use in a retaliatory mode or in a preemptive or first strike mode.
Right, and I'm saying that actually
convincing people that the president shouldn't have the ability to respond in the event.
I absolutely agree that that is a hard problem, but there are at least 50 proposals for how that can be done, in the same way as we have proposals for how the FISA court system works, how specific committees of Congress have the ability to have expedited action. We have a number of proposals that can be debated, and we can't even get them to the floor in part because I think we actually have this really weird bifurcation. We have the arms control community that's like, world government time, we're going to do this all through the UN. And then we have the people who care about executive power, which also tend to care about things like gun rights and other things. And and also, this is the other problem. Everyone cares about executive power when they're not in power. And this is a weird moment where we might actually have a weird coincidence of those things. And we could get that back on the table. I'm not saying it's an easy fight. I'm just saying we haven't had that opportunity since Nixon. And I think that the level of irresponsibility, and I say this having just gotten back like a month and a half ago from a NATO event, where even the people who are like paid to support Trump were like, we don't have a lot of confidence in the ability for this person to make decisions. And on the European side, we do not have a lot of confidence that this person can keep us safe. And so I think we might actually find that the way to the global is through the national, whereas we thought before the way to the national was through the global. And that may change. I don't think that's permanent, but we've got to give up on this idea that it's one or the other. And this is a moment where we can go the other way.